Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepbooks reading tonight. Settle in, slow everything down, and let the soft rain in the background carry you deeper into the quiet. Before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you never miss a new chapter. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I always love seeing that. If you want full early access to entire books, join the Patreon where complete series are available. Now, take a breath, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle hum, and let's drift together into tonight's story. I pleaded with Edward, asking if I could ask just one more question as he accelerated much too quickly down the quiet street, not seeming to pay any attention at all to the road ahead. He sighed and agreed to one, his lips pressing together into a tight, cautious line. I immediately jumped on the question I should have asked earlier, saying he had known I hadn't gone into the bookstore and that I had gone south, and I wondered how he knew that specific detail. He looked away, deliberately stalling, and I grumbled that I thought we were past all the evasiveness now. He almost smiled, then simply admitted, "Fine then, I followed your scent." He looked back at the road, giving me time to compose my face. I couldn't think of an acceptable, immediate response to that impossible statement, but I filed the information carefully away for future study. I tried to refocus the conversation, unwilling to let him be finished now that he was finally beginning to explain things. I stalled again, saying he still hadn't answered one of my very first questions, and he looked at me with disapproval, asking which one. I asked for clarification on the entire mind-reading ability, asking if he could read anybody's mind anywhere, and if the rest of his family could do it as well, feeling silly for asking clarification on what felt like make-believe. He immediately pointed out that those were more than one question, but I simply intertwined my fingers and gazed at him, waiting patiently for his answer. He said it was just him, and he couldn't hear anyone anywhere, noting he had to be fairly close. He explained that the more familiar someone's voice was, the farther away he could hear them, but still no more than a few miles. He paused thoughtfully, comparing the experience to being in a huge hall filled with people, everyone talking at once. He said it was just a constant hum, a buzzing of voices in the background, until he focused on one voice, and then what they were thinking became perfectly clear. He added that most of the time he tuned it all out, because it could be very distracting. He frowned as he said the word, explaining it was easier to seem normal when he wasn't accidentally answering someone's thoughts rather than their spoken words. I asked him curiously why he thought he couldn't hear me at all. He looked at me, his eyes enigmatic, and murmured that he simply didn't know. He offered his only guess, which was that maybe my mind didn't work the same way the rest of theirs did, like my thoughts were on the AM frequency, and he was only getting FM. He suddenly grinned at me, looking amused. I felt the words bother me more than they should, and asked if he meant my mind didn't work right, and that I was a freak. He laughed in response, saying he heard voices in his mind, and yet I was worried that I was the freak. He told me not to worry, that it was just a theory, but his face immediately tightened as he said this, brought us back to me and my silence. I sighed, wondering how to even begin the conversation again, and he reminded me softly that we were past all the evasions now. I looked away from his face for the first time, trying to find the words to explain myself, and happened to notice the speedometer. I immediately shouted in panic, "Holy crow, slow down." He was startled, asking what was wrong, but the car did not decelerate at all. I was still shouting that he was going 100 miles an hour. I shot a panicky glance out the window, but it was too dark to see much. The road was only visible in the long bluish patch of brightness from the headlights. The forest along both sides of the road was like a solid black wall, as hard as a wall of steel, if we veered off the road at this terrifying speed. He rolled his eyes, telling me to relax, still not slowing down. I demanded to know if he was trying to kill us, and he replied that we weren't going to crash. I tried to modulate my voice, asking why he was in such a hurry all the time. He turned to smile crookedly at me, saying he always drove like this. I shouted at him to keep his eyes on the road. He grinned, tapping his forehead, and claimed he had never been in an accident or even gotten a ticket because of his built-in radar detector. I fumed, telling him that Charlie was a cop and I was raised to abide by traffic laws. I noted that if he turned us into a Volvo pretzel around a tree trunk, he could probably just walk away. He agreed with a short, hard laugh that he probably could, but I couldn't. He sighed, and I watched with immense relief as the needle gradually drifted toward 80 miles per hour. I told him I was almost happy, and he muttered that he hated driving slow. He snapped that I had given enough commentary on his driving, and reminded me he was still waiting for my latest theory. I bit my lip, and he looked down at me, his honey eyes unexpectedly gentle. He promised me he wouldn't laugh, and I told him I was more afraid that he would simply be angry with me. He asked if it was that bad, and I confirmed that it pretty much was. I was looking down at my hands, so I couldn't see his full expression, but his voice was calm as he urged me to go ahead. I admitted that I didn't know how to start the sensitive conversation, and he suggested I start at the beginning, noting that I'd mentioned not coming up with the theory entirely on my own. I confirmed that I hadn't. He probed, asking if a book or a movie had started me on this path. I told him no, that it was Saturday at the beach, and I risked a glance up at his face, finding him puzzled. I continued, explaining that I ran into an old family friend, Jacob Black, whose dad and Charlie had been close friends since I was a baby. His confused expression froze in place as I mentioned Jacob's dad was one of the Quileute elders. I told him we had gone for a walk, editing out all my scheming, and that Jacob was telling me some old legends, trying to scare me, I thought. I hesitated, whispering that he had told me one specific story about vampires. I couldn't look at his face now, but I saw his knuckles tighten convulsively on the steering wheel. He asked, still calm, if I had immediately thought of him. I told him no, that Jacob had specifically mentioned his family. He was silent, staring intently at the road. I was suddenly worried about protecting Jacob. I quickly said that Jacob just thought it was a silly superstition and didn't expect me to think anything of it. It didn't seem like enough, so I confessed that it was my fault because I had forced him to tell me the story. He asked me why, and I explained that Lauren had said something about him, trying to provoke me, and an older boy from the tribe had said his family didn't come to the reservation, only it sounded like he meant something entirely different. I admitted, hanging my head, that I got Jacob alone and tricked the story out of him. He startled me by laughing, but his eyes were fierce as he stared ahead. He asked how I had tricked him, and I replied, disbelief colouring my tone, that I had tried to flirt and it had worked better than I thought it would. He chuckled darkly, saying he would like to have seen that, and teased me, saying I had accused him of dazzling people, poor Jacob Black. I blushed, looking out my window into the dark night. He asked what I did next, and I told him I did some research on the internet. He asked if that had convinced me. His voice barely interested, but his hands were clamped hard onto the steering wheel. I told him no, that nothing fit, and most of it was kind of silly. I stopped again, and he prompted me to continue. I whispered. I decided it didn't matter. His tone made me look up. I had finally broken through his carefully composed mask. His face was incredulous, with just a hint of the anger I'd feared, as he repeated, "It didn't matter." I said softly, "No, it doesn't matter to me what you are." A hard, mocking edge entered his voice, asking if I didn't care if he was a monster, if he wasn't human. I replied, "No." He was silent, staring straight ahead again, his face bleak and cold. I sighed, saying he was angry and that I shouldn't have said anything. He said, "No," but his tone was as hard as his face, quoting me, "It doesn't matter." I gasped. "I'm right." He asked, "Does it matter?" I took a deep breath. I told him not really, but I was curious. He was suddenly resigned, asking what I was curious about. I asked him how old he was, and he answered promptly, 17. I asked him how long he had been 17, and his lips twitched as he stared at the road, admitting at last, a while. I smiled. pleased that he was still being honest with me. He stared down at me with watchful eyes, and I smiled wider in encouragement, which caused him to frown. I tried not to laugh as I asked, "Don't laugh, but how can you come out during the daytime?" He laughed anyway, saying, "Myth." I asked about being burned by the sun, and he said, "Myth." I asked about sleeping in coffins, and he replied, "Myth." He hesitated, and a peculiar tone entered his voice, saying, "I can't sleep." It took me a minute to absorb that fact, and I asked if he meant at all. He said, his voice nearly inaudible, "Never." He turned to look at me with a wistful expression, his golden eyes holding mine until I lost my train of thought. He looked away, his voice hard now, saying I hadn't asked him the most important question yet. I blinked, still dazed, and asked which one that was. He asked sarcastically if I wasn't concerned about his diet. I murmured, "Oh, that." His voice was bleak, as he asked if I didn't want to know if he drank blood. I flinched, saying Jacob had said something about that. He asked flatly what Jacob had said. I told him Jacob said he didn't hunt people, and that his family wasn't supposed to be dangerous because they only hunted animals. His voice was deeply skeptical, as he asked if Jacob said they weren't dangerous. I clarified that Jacob said they weren't supposed to be dangerous, but the Quilliots still didn't want them on their land just in case. He looked forward, and I tried to keep my voice as even as possible, asking if Jacob was right about not hunting people. He whispered, "The Quilliots have a long memory," which I took as a confirmation. He immediately warned me not to let that make me complacent, saying they were right to keep their distance because they were still dangerous. I told him I didn't understand. He explained slowly that they tried, and they were usually very good at what they did, but sometimes they made mistakes, giving himself as an example, allowing himself to be alone with me. I heard the sadness in my voice as I asked if this was a mistake. He murmured, "A very dangerous one." We were both silent then. I watched the headlights twist too fast with the curves of the road, and I was hideously afraid that I would never have another chance to be with him like this again. His words hinted at an end, and I recoiled from the idea. I couldn't waste 1 minute I had with him. I asked desperately for him to tell me more, not caring what he said, just so I could hear his voice again. He looked at me quickly, startled by the change in my tone, and asked what more I wanted to know. I suggested he tell me why he hunted animals instead of people, my voice still tinged with desperation. I realized my eyes were wet, and I fought against the grief that was trying to overpower me. He replied, his voice very low, "I don't want to be a monster." I asked if animals weren't enough, and he paused. He said he couldn't be sure, but he would compare it to living on tofu and soy milk. He called it vegetarian, their little inside joke. He explained that it didn't completely satiate the hunger or thirst, but it kept them strong enough to resist. Most of the time. His tone turned ominous, as he added that sometimes it was more difficult than others. I asked if it was very difficult for him now, and he sighed, saying, "Yes." I stated, "But you're not hungry now," confidently. He asked why I thought that, and I explained, "Your eyes. I told you I had a theory. I've noticed that people, men in particular, are crabbier when they're hungry." He chuckled, saying I was observant, and I didn't answer, just listening to the sound of his laugh, committing it to memory. When it was quiet again, I asked if he was hunting this weekend with Emmett. He confirmed he was, then paused, as if deciding whether or not to say something. He admitted he hadn't wanted to leave, but it was necessary, saying it was a bit easier to be around me when he wasn't thirsty. I asked why he hadn't wanted to leave. He replied, his eyes gentle but intense, that it made him anxious to be away from me. He said he wasn't joking when he asked me to try not to fall in the ocean or get run over, and that he was distracted all weekend worrying about me. He shook his head, saying that after what happened tonight, he was surprised that I had made it through a whole weekend unscathed. He then corrected himself, saying, "Well, not totally unscathed." He asked if I knew what he meant, reminding me of my hands. I looked down at my palms. at the almost healed scrapes across the heels of my hands. I sighed, saying, "I fell." His lips curved up at the corners as he said that was what he thought. He supposed, being me, it could have been much worse, and that possibility had tormented him the entire time he was away. He confessed it had been a very long 3 days, and he really got on Emmett's nerves. I asked in confusion, 3 days? Didn't you just get back today? I was frustrated and almost angry as I thought of how much disappointment I had suffered because of his absence. He said no, they had gotten back Sunday. I demanded to know why none of them were in school. He explained that I had asked if the sun hurt him, and it didn't, but he couldn't go out in the sunlight, at least not where anyone could see. I asked why, and he promised he would show me sometime. I thought about it for a moment, then decided he might have called me. He was puzzled, saying he knew I was safe. I hesitated, dropping my eyes, and said I hadn't known where he was. He prompted, "What?" His velvety voice was compelling. I blushed to be saying this out loud, admitting I hadn't liked not seeing him, and that it made me anxious too. He was quiet. I glanced up, apprehensive, and saw that his expression was pained. He groaned quietly, saying, "Oh, this is wrong." I couldn't understand his response and asked what I had said. He turned his anguished eyes to the road, his words flowing almost too fast for me to understand. He said he didn't want to hear that I felt that way. His voice was low but urgent, and his words cut me. He insisted, "It's wrong. It's not safe. I'm dangerous, Bella. Please grasp that." I tried very hard not to look like a sulky child as I replied, "No." He growled that he was serious, and I said that so was I, insisting it didn't matter what he was because it was too late. His voice whipped out, low and harsh, telling me, "Never say that." I bit my lip, glad he couldn't know how much that hurt, and stared out at the road. We must be close now, despite how fast he was driving. He asked what I was thinking, his voice still raw, and I just shook my head, unsure if I could speak. I kept my eyes forward, but I could feel his gaze on my face. He sounded appalled as he asked if I was crying. I hadn't realized the moisture in my eyes had brimmed over, and I quickly rubbed my hand across my cheek, confirming the traitor tears were there, betraying me. I said, "No," but my voice cracked. I saw him reach toward me hesitantly with his right hand, but then he stopped and placed it slowly back on the steering wheel. His voice burned with regret as he said, "I'm sorry. I knew he wasn't just apologizing for the words that had upset me." The darkness slipped by us in silence. After another minute, he struggled to use a lighter tone, asking me to tell him something. I said yes. He asked what I was thinking tonight, just before he came around the corner. He said he couldn't understand my expression, noting I didn't look that scared, but looked like I was concentrating very hard on something. I admitted I was trying to remember how to incapacitate an attacker, and that I was going to smash his nose into his brain, thinking of the dark-haired man with a surge of hate. He was upset, asking if I was going to fight them and if I didn't think about running. I admitted I fell down a lot when I ran. He asked about screaming for help, and I said I was getting to that part. He shook his head, saying I was right. He was definitely fighting fate, trying to keep me alive. I sighed. We were slowing, passing into the boundaries of Forks. It had taken less than 20 minutes. I demanded, "Will I see you tomorrow?" He smiled, saying, "Yes, I have a paper due too." He promised to save me a seat at lunch. It was silly, after everything we'd been through tonight, how that little promise sent flutters through my stomach and made me unable to speak. We were in front of Charlie's house. The lights were on, my truck in its place, everything utterly normal. It was like waking from a dream. He stopped the car, but I didn't move. I asked if he promised to be there tomorrow. He said, "I promise." I considered that for a moment, then nodded. I pulled his jacket off, taking one last whiff. He reminded me I could keep it since I didn't have a jacket for tomorrow. I handed it back to him, saying I didn't want to have to explain it to Charlie. He grinned, saying, "Oh, right, I hesitated, my hand on the door handle, trying to prolong the moment. He asked, "Bella," in a different tone, serious but hesitant. I turned back to him too eagerly, saying, "Yes?" He asked if I would promise him something, and I instantly regretted my unconditional agreement, fearing he would ask me to stay away from him. He frowned, his eyes tight as he stared past me out the window, and told me, "Don't go into the woods alone." I stared at him in blank confusion, asking why. He said he wasn't always the most dangerous thing out there, and to leave it at that. I shuddered slightly at the sudden bleakness in his voice, but I was relieved that this was an easy promise to honour. I said, "Whatever you say." He sighed, saying he would see me tomorrow, and I knew he wanted me to leave now. I said, "Tomorrow, then." I opened the door unwillingly. He asked, "Bella?" I turned and he was leaning toward me, his pale, glorious face just inches from mine. My heart stopped beating. He said, "Sleep well." His breath blew in my face, stunning me. It was the same exquisite scent that clung to his jacket, but in a more concentrated form. I blinked, thoroughly dazed. He leaned away. I was unable to move until my brain had somewhat unscrambled itself. Then I stepped out of the car awkwardly, having to use the frame for support. I thought I heard him chuckle, but the sound was too quiet for me to be certain. He waited until I had stumbled to the front door, and then I heard his engine quietly rev. I turned to watch the silver car disappear around the corner. I realized it was very cold. I reached for the key mechanically, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. Charlie called from the living room. "Bella?" I walked in to see him, telling him it was me. He was watching a baseball game. He was surprised I was home early, noting it wasn't even 8 yet. I told him I was just tired because I did a lot of walking. He sounded concerned, and I wondered what my face looked like. I told him I was just going to call Jessica first. He asked, surprised, if I wasn't just with her, and I explained I left my jacket in her car and wanted to make sure she brought it tomorrow. He advised me to give her a chance to get home first, and I agreed. I went to the kitchen and fell, exhausted, into a chair, feeling dizzy now. I wondered if I was going to go into shock after all, but I told myself to get a grip. The phone rang suddenly, startling me, and I yanked it off the hook, asking breathlessly, "Hello?" It was Jess, and her voice was relieved and surprised that I had made it home. I quickly told her I left my jacket in her car and asked her to bring it tomorrow. She demanded to know what happened, and I quietly said, "Tomorrow in Trig." "Okay." She caught on quickly, asking if my dad was there, and I confirmed that he was. She said she would talk to me tomorrow, and I could hear the impatience in her voice as she said goodbye. I walked up the stairs slowly, a heavy stupor clouding my mind. I went through the motions of getting ready for bed without paying any attention to what I was doing. It wasn't until I was in the shower, the water too hot burning my skin, that I realized I was freezing. I shuddered violently for several minutes before the steaming spray could finally relax my rigid muscles. Then I stood in the shower, too tired to move, until the hot water began to run out. I stumbled out, wrapping myself securely in a towel, trying to hold the heat in so the aching shivers wouldn't return. I dressed for bed swiftly and climbed under my quilt, curling into a ball, hugging myself to keep warm. A few small shudders trembled through me. My mind still swirled dizzily, full of images I couldn't understand, and some I fought to repress. Nothing seemed clear at first, but as I fell gradually closer to unconsciousness, a few certainties became evident. About 3 things I was absolutely positive. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was part of him, and I didn't know how potent that part might be, that thirsted for my blood. And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him.